Today we're talking about analyzing fiction and poetry. Reading fiction and poetry is not all that different from reading nonfiction, but there are a few things that can help us as we proceed through our fiction and poetry. First, we have to remember that not everything is a symbol, and if something is symbolic, we have to be very clear about what it symbolizes. So I think as we have approached fiction and poetry, maybe in the past or in high school, we tend to think that everything is a symbol, but that doesn't always have to hold true. You also don't want to just summarize the piece only. I don't need to know what it is about again, especially if it's a short piece. Usually a summary can occur in the introduction in just a couple of sentences, and that gives me enough information in order to access the piece. You don't want to conflate either. Don't assume that the author or the poet or the creator of the text is the same as the persona presented in the text. Many poets assume different speakers, and many authors write from different perspectives. So we have to know the context, and we have to not be lazy and just assume that that person's life equals the poem. Do get specific and do use the text to make your point. You can't just assume that you know what the text is and project onto the text. We do that to a certain degree by having a perspective, but we don't want to do it so much that we do violence to the text. We want to construct our own arguments. We do that by thinking about what is emphasized and what is not emphasized or absent from a text. And this is exactly the same thing that we did with nonfiction, so these should seem familiar to you because they are. As we're making meaning, we look for sometimes a little bit different things because fiction and poetry are different than nonfiction, although they have a lot of things in common. We want to look for repetitions. Anytime you see a word repeated or a sentence repeated, at the beginning of Grapes of Wrath, there's a sentence that's repeated almost verbatim 400 pages later. And that's not because the author, John Steinbeck, was careless. It's because he's trying to emphasize something, and that a careful reader will find those little clues and find those emphases and make important judgments about them. Motifs are things that sometimes recur. So I don't know if you ever remember watching Phineas and Ferb, but there was a giant baby head that used to appear in random Phineas and Ferb episodes. And that's just a motif and not necessarily symbolic of anything, but it had a connection, some sort of a silly connection to the text of the cartoon. Juxtapositions are things that are put together that might not normally come together. So words, sentences, ideas, things that might not normally be placed next to each other. So we might think of peanut butter and jelly as being a very clearly matched pair, but if you put peanut butter in juxtaposition to something like a filet mignon, then all of a sudden you have sort of a lowbrow kind of everyday snack with a very fancy meal, and that would be something that should bring our attention. And of course we do need to pay attention to all manner of things, especially the details of poetry, like line breaks, the details of grammar, the voice in which we are talking, so first person, second person, third person. If a poem is in first person, everybody wants to conflate that I with the poet, but that's not always the case. Second person is using the word you or your, and third person would be he, she, they, and so forth. You also want to note allusions to other works, and that can also bring you to intertextual connections, so connections within the text itself, like I was talking about with Grapes of Wrath, a longer work, or intratextual connections, and that's connections between works themselves. And so sometimes we're reading something that makes us think of something else, or an author has two different works that can help inform one another, and those are very helpful connections to make. When you develop an original thesis, you're thinking about all the same things that we just talked about with nonfiction, and those things can include all the things listed here: contrasts, context, diction, syntax, all of those different things. When you support your thesis, it's also no different from the nonfiction approach. You have to have quotations and textual evidence from the original text and secondary research as we move forward into the writing of the essay to help support our thesis. You have two pieces that you will be looking at and working with today and for class today. You're reading Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, which is like 650 words. Very, very short story. And you need to know just a little bit about Kincaid, that she was raised in St. John's, Antigua, where the story is set. It was published in 1983, even though it's focused on an earlier time. She was born in 1949. That might help you a little bit. And her writing often focuses on colonialism, racism, mother and daughter relationships, which is very obvious in this piece, and power dynamics. As we read and annotate today, hopefully you'll make a few annotations before you come to class, and then in class we're going to talk about those annotations, and then we'll be working through our discussion board together to make model thesis statements as we did together on Thursday. As we think about developing an original thesis, one of the things that I wanted to do on Tuesday and didn't get quite done in the first class was to develop our question. So we have observations, and then we want to develop a research question. That was exemplified in the discussion board, so maybe you got that sense already. But for Jamaica Kincaid, one of the things that I observed was the double standards for women. So my research question would be, in what ways do women help perpetuate oppression against other women? And our possible thesis could be, the girl's inheritance includes the tools for her own self-oppression. So that's something that it would be really workable. You could use evidence from the text, but it's not the only way of approaching that text. There are so many other things, even in those 650 words, that would be worth writing about. So I'm excited to hear your things today and see where you go with that text. The poem is a little bit different. It's a collection of poems from A Timbered Choir by Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a poet who lives in Kentucky. He's still alive. He's in his 80s. He writes a lot of poetry that is centered on his Christian faith, but he wouldn't call himself a Christian poet. And this collection of poems is a Sunday poem, a Sabbath poem. And I just included the first section here. Some Sunday afternoon, it may be you are sitting under your porch roof, looking down through the trees to the river, watching the rain. The circles made by the raindrops striking expand, intersect, and dissolve. So one of the things that I wanted to point out here was the conditional may be and the second person you. And this is called a caesura. It is a stop in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a line of poetry, not in the middle of a sentence. But it can be if it was a semicolon. Poets do this, and they do it in such a way that breaks our train of thought in the middle of a line, and you don't normally think of that being a good thing. But if there is a caesura in the middle of a line, there's usually something to think about there. So with poems, you want to think about the ends of the lines. You want to think about the way the line expands. You want to think about how this line particularly is longer than the other lines. So there are lots of things that you can do. You may not understand a poem on first reading, but you can keep reading it until you do. And a lot of people are afraid of poetry, which is why I put one in here. And I want you to think about this, especially if you're using song lyrics as well, because this is not just about Wendell Berry's life and a song. We may be very tempted to think about the song as being biographical. So we want to think through what we're observing here. So my observations from Wendell Berry actually focused more on that conditional verb may and some Sunday afternoon and sometimes here we are there in the hands of the dead. All of those things were about an emphasis for me on time. And the question that I ask is, how does the emphasis on time in the poem reflect eternal time and heaven? My possible thesis was, Berry's blend of present, past, and future suggests that heaven is not restricted to a future moment. I think I could write an essay about that. And I'm interested to hear what you have to say about these as well. So we're going to do both of these in class on Tuesday, and I hope that this helps you frame your approach to these two pieces.